She dropped the bag. Not from carelessness. Not from distraction. The elevator doors opened onto the 14th floor, and she stepped out, and the room was wrong. Completely, immediately wrong. And her hands made the decision before her brain finished processing what her eyes were seeing. The brown paper bag hit marble tile. A container split at the seam. The smell of food spread through a silence so absolute it had its own weight. She didn't move. 8 men in expensive suits sat around a table that cost more than her apartment. Nobody reached for a napkin. Nobody pushed back a chair. Nobody looked at the food on the floor. The room stayed exactly as it was, like a photograph of itself, and the only thing in it that moved was one man. Early 30s, white shirt open at the collar, forearms covered in ink, gold watch catching the low light from above the table, who leaned forward slowly and looked at her. Not at the mess. At her hands. Still gripping the torn paper handles of the bag, even though the bag was on the floor. Knuckles tight. Curls spilling from beneath her red cap. Wide eyes that were trying very hard to hold something together that was threatening to come apart in front of strangers. He studied her the way a man studied something he hadn't expected to find. Not with irritation, not with dismissal, but with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had spent 15 years learning that the most important information in any room was never the obvious thing. The obvious thing was the food on the floor. The important thing was the shaking. What Evelyn Dominique didn't know, what she couldn't have known standing in that doorway with her hands still gripping nothing, was that the man leaning forward at the head of that table had built an entire life around the principle that nothing surprised him. He had arranged his world so completely, so precisely, that surprise was no longer a variable he had to account for. She had just become a variable. He said 2 words. Quiet, unhurried. The tone of a man who had never needed to repeat himself and wasn't about to start. Sit down. And Evelyn, 24 years old, 3 jobs, 6 hours on a bicycle in November rain, a life balanced on arithmetic that stopped working the moment one number changed, sat down. Not because she wasn't afraid. Because she was so tired that when someone offered her a chair, she didn't have anything left to argue with. Nobody in that room had expected her to say yes. Least of all her. But to understand what Evelyn was carrying into that room, and why the man at the head of the table looked at her hands instead of the floor, and why that decision would change both their lives before the night was over, we need to go back. Back to the Friday that started before sunrise, to the bicycle with the sticking brake, to the notebook under the mattress with 2 years of menus written in the margins, to the life she had been holding together with both hands for so long that by the time she walked into that elevator, she was already shaking before the doors even opened. This story is for every person who has been carrying too much for too long and hasn't yet been told that their hands are allowed to rest. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because what happens next is going to stay with you. Evelyn had been on her bicycle since 4 in the afternoon. It was a Friday in November, which meant the city was wet and impatient, and every driver who passed her on Peachtree Street treated the bike lane as a suggestion worth ignoring. She had already done a 6-hour shift at the hospital cafeteria that morning, starting at 5:30, ending at 11:45, the kind of shift that left the smell of industrial cleaner in your hair regardless of what you did afterward. She had gone straight from there to the salon in Kirkwood where she assisted on Fridays, shampooing, sweeping, holding foils, whatever Ms. Renee needed, until 3:15, when she changed in the back room, put on her red cap and hoodie, clipped her backpack across her shoulders, and got on the bicycle. 6 hours of deliveries. $41 in tips. The back brake sticking on every downhill the way it had been sticking for 3 months since she couldn't find a Tuesday afternoon and $40 in the same week to fix it. Here is what you need to understand about Evelyn Dominique's life. It ran on arithmetic. Not the comfortable kind. Not the kind with margins and contingencies built in for the unexpected. The kind where every number had a name and every name had a consequence, and the only acceptable outcome was that all of them balanced by the end of the month. Rent was $940. The hospital cafeteria paid $13.20 an hour. The salon paid $11 flat plus whatever the customers left for the shampoo girl, which was usually nothing and occasionally $3 and once, memorably, a 20 from a woman who said Evelyn had magic hands and then never came back. The delivery app paid per order plus tips, which meant rain was good because guilty customers tipped better in bad weather. And that was the only good thing about rain as far as the bicycle was concerned. The medical debt was $23,400. Her mother's, technically, though not hers in any legal sense, only in every practical one. She was the one who answered the phone. She was the one with her mother's address on file and her mother's paperwork in a folder under the kitchen counter, and a collections agent who called every Tuesday at 10 in the morning with the regularity of a second alarm clock she had never asked for. She could not make herself tell them that the woman they were looking for was gone. She had tried once, early on, and the word had stopped in her throat, and she had said instead that she would look into it and call back. And she had been looking into it and calling back for 14 months. Her brother Marcus was 17. He was starting a trade school program in electrical systems in 6 weeks, the kind of program with a waiting list and a non-refundable deposit and a start date that did not negotiate. Evelyn had the deposit saved in a separate account she did not touch for any reason, including eviction notices. She had received 2 of those in the past 18 months. She had resolved both through a combination of overtime shifts and the particular skill she had developed for making landlords believe the money was on its way when it was, in fact, nowhere near on its way. The current landlord had sent his first notice 3 weeks ago. She was managing it. She was always managing something. The notebook was under her mattress. It had been there for 2 years. A black composition notebook with a water stain on the lower right corner from a delivery shift during which she had been caught in a rainstorm near Little 5 Points and refused to stop writing because she only had 20 minutes and she had learned to protect her 20 minutes fiercely. 37 pages inside. Menus in her careful handwriting. Supplier names and wholesale prices. A pricing model she had rebuilt 4 times as her understanding of the market improved. A catering concept built entirely around her mother's recipes, the real ones, from the handwritten index cards in the recipe box on the kitchen counter. Jerk chicken and oxtail and brown stew fish and the sweet potato pudding that relatives requested by name at every gathering for as long as Evelyn could remember. She had imagined it elevated, plated properly, the kind of food that belonged at events rather than in styrofoam containers. She revised the plan every few months when she had 30 minutes and enough energy left over to want something for herself. Then she put the notebook back under the mattress, because wanting something and having the conditions to pursue it were 2 entirely different categories, and she was not yet in the second one. She told herself she would be, eventually. She told herself first things first. Her last delivery of the night came through at 9:47. The app flagged it with a yellow star, priority order, premium tip guaranteed regardless of rating. The address was a building on Peachtree Center Avenue she didn't recognize. Not a restaurant. Not a residence. A commercial tower, the kind with a lobby you needed a keycard for and a directory that stopped listing tenants above a certain floor. The delivery instructions contained an access code, a floor number, and a single line of additional guidance. 14th floor, use the freight elevator, do not be late. She almost declined it. The address was unfamiliar and the instruction was strange, and it was almost 10 at night, and she had been riding since 4. But the tip was guaranteed, and the tip was $40, and $40 was the back break. So she accepted the order and turned her bicycle toward Peachtree Center Avenue and rode through the rain. She found the freight elevator at a side entrance behind a service door, entered the code, and stepped in. The car was slow. It smelled like industrial carpet and the specific quiet of a building that had stopped being a regular building somewhere around the 8th floor. The kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful but institutional. The quiet of spaces not meant for people who didn't already know what they were walking into. She checked the order details twice on her phone. She adjusted the bag in her hands, redistributing the weight left to right. A small automatic correction she had been making all evening without noticing. The doors opened on 14. The sound changed immediately. Not louder, the opposite. The specific, absolute silence of a room where every person in it had stopped talking at precisely the same moment, for reasons that had nothing to do with her arrival. She stepped out. She saw the table first. Long, dark wood. 8 men arranged around it in suits that cost more than several of her monthly rents combined. They sat with the particular stillness of people who were accustomed to stillness, who had been in enough rooms like this one to know that stillness was not merely comfortable, but expected. She saw the room. Low light from fixtures overhead that cast everything in warm amber, marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows showing the city below like a map of itself, the kind of space that existed for no reason except to communicate something about the people who occupied it, and communicated it without effort, without announcement, the way certain rooms simply did. Then she saw the man at the head of the table. White shirt, open at the collar. Sleeves rolled precisely to mid-forearm, exposing ink that covered both arms from wrist to elbow. Black and gray work, dense and detailed, visible even across the length of the room. Gold watch on his left wrist, catching the low amber light. Black hair slicked back above a face that was angular in the way of faces that have never been softened by ease. Sharp jaw, defined cheekbones, a stillness in his expression that was not blankness but control, the specific control of a man who had decided a long time ago that his face was information and had learned to manage what it disclosed. His eyes found her the moment the elevator doors opened. Before she had finished stepping through. Before she had fully processed what she was looking at. They did not move from her face. Her hands made their decision before the rest of her caught up. The bag hit the marble. A container split at the seam and the smell of food spread across a silence, so complete it felt like a physical thing, like the silence had weight and the bag falling had disturbed it, and now everyone in the room was waiting for it to settle again. She stood with her hands still gripping the torn paper handles of a bag that was no longer in them, knuckles tight, curls escaping from beneath the red cap, mouth slightly open around a breath she hadn't finished taking. Her shoulders were rigid with the effort of not visibly coming apart in front of 8 strangers in a room she had not been prepared for. She braced. She had a working theory about what came next. It involved being asked to leave. Possibly a call to the app. Definitely no $40 tip. She held all of that behind her expression and kept her face as neutral as she could manage, which was reasonably neutral, because she had been keeping her face neutral under pressure for years and had gotten competent at it. The man at the head of the table leaned forward. Slowly, his forearms came to rest on the dark wood, tattooed arms bracketing the space in front of him. And his eyes, which had not moved from her face since the elevator opened, moved now. Not to the food on the floor. Not to the mess spreading across the marble. Not to any of the 8 men who had not shifted or spoken since she arrived. To her hands. Still gripping nothing. Knuckles pale against the deep, warm brown of her skin. Shaking slightly, though she was working very hard to stop that, had been working on it since the bag hit the floor and had not yet succeeded. He looked at her hands for a long moment. Long enough that the room stayed exactly as it was. Nobody spoke, nobody moved, the silence held. And in that silence something shifted, though she couldn't have named what. He was not looking at the problem she had made. He was looking at something else entirely, something specific, something that had registered in him the way important information registered in a person who had spent a long time learning the difference between what was visible and what was true. Then he said 2 words. Quiet. Unhurried. The tone of a man who had stopped needing volume to be heard so long ago that raising his voice was no longer part of his vocabulary. Sit down. Nobody moved. Not the 8 men around the table. Not the one standing near the far wall whose hand had shifted toward his jacket when the elevator opened and had not shifted back. Not the man directly to Yun-Gi Cho's right who had been mid-sentence when the doors opened and had not finished the sentence and showed no indication of intending to. The room stayed exactly as the 2 words had left it, suspended, waiting, arranged entirely around the fact that something had just happened that none of them had a prepared response for. And they were all waiting to take their cue from the man at the head of the table, who had not moved except to lean forward, and who had not looked away from the girl in the red hoodie, standing in the middle of his floor with her hands gripping nothing. Evelyn stood in that suspension for 2 seconds. Maybe 3. Long enough to understand that the room was not going to resolve itself without her making a decision, and long enough to understand that the decision she made was going to determine the shape of the next several minutes in a room she had no framework for. She sat down. Not from obedience. She was not, by nature or by practice, someone who responded to instructions from strangers without processing them first. Not from fear exactly, though fear was present, had been present since the elevator doors opened, was threaded through every muscle currently working to keep her expression composed. She sat down because she had been on her feet since 5:30 in the morning, and it was now 10 at night, and her body registered the presence of a chair the way it registered the presence of food. as something that existed in the category of things she needed and had been doing without for longer than was sustainable. The chair was there. She sat in it. Her body made the decision before the part of her that managed appearances could intervene. The chair was against the wall near the elevator, not at the table. She kept her backpack on. She set her hands on her knees and looked at the man at the head of the table and waited. He looked at her for a moment. Then he asked her name. His voice was the same both times, the two words that had just rearranged the room, and now this question. The same register, the same unhurried quality, the same absence of anything that needed to perform itself. It was the voice of a man for whom speaking was a considered act rather than a reflexive one, which meant every word he chose was the word he meant, and the question meant exactly what it said. Evelyn, she said. Evelyn Dominique. He nodded once. The nod of someone filing information rather than acknowledging a pleasantry. Then he asked if she had eaten. She had not. She had skipped dinner at 6:15 to fit in 2 additional deliveries in the window before the priority order came through, calculating that the guaranteed $40 tip outweighed the cost of delaying food by 3 or 4 hours, which was a calculation she had made correctly on paper and was now paying for in the specific lightheadedness that came from a body that had been running on a granola bar and half a bottle of water since noon. Before that, lunch had been half a sandwich eaten standing over the salon's shampoo sink during a 4-minute break, because Ms. Renee's 2:15 had arrived at 2, and there was no pause between clients on Fridays. She said no. Just the word. She didn't follow it with an explanation or a qualifier or the apologetic contextualization she usually deployed when someone noticed she hadn't taken care of herself. The "I've just been busy" or the "I was going to eat when I got home" that functioned as small preemptive pardons for the crime of having needs. She was too tired for the performance, and something about the directness of the question had bypassed the mechanism entirely. He had asked a plain question. She gave him the plain answer. He turned to the man on his right and said something in Korean. Brief, 4 or 5 words, the tone of someone giving an instruction they expect to be carried out rather than discussed. The man stood immediately and left through a door at the back of the room without speaking. What arrived 14 minutes later was not food from a delivery bag. It was real food, carried out on actual plates by someone who moved with the care of a person for whom the handling of things mattered. Korean, several dishes, set on a small side table that had been positioned near Evelyn's chair while she wasn't watching, close enough that she didn't have to cross the room to reach it. Galbi jjim, rich and dark. A stone bowl of rice still producing a thin curl of steam. Banchan in small white dishes arranged in a row, pickled radish, seasoned spinach, something bright and red she didn't recognize, but which smelled like ginger and vinegar and warmth. She looked at it. Then she looked at the man at the head of the table. He was watching her with the same focused, unhurried attention he had given her since the elevator opened, and she understood something in that moment that she couldn't have articulated in words, but recognized in the way you recognize things that bypassed language and registered somewhere more fundamental. He was not doing this to be generous. He was not performing benevolence for the room or managing a situation that had become awkward or deploying the food as a way of making her easier to deal with. He had seen something specific and had responded to it specifically, and the response was this. And the decision had been made with the same quality of precision she was beginning to understand characterized everything he did. No excess, no announcement, no requirement that she perform gratitude in a particular register before it counted. She ate. The room remained quiet around her. Not the tense silence of before, not the suspended waiting. Something that had settled into a different quality, a working quiet, the kind that existed in rooms where something was being processed that didn't require speech. 2 of the men at the table had resumed a low conversation at the far end. The man near the wall had moved to sit. Nobody looked at her directly. Nobody made her feel observed, though she was being observed, because the man at the head of the table had not looked away. She noticed that he had not looked at the food on the floor. Not once, from the moment the bag hit the marble to now, 11 minutes later, food still spread across the tile between the elevator and the table. He had not referenced it, had not gestured toward it, had not allowed his eyes to travel to it in that pointed way people use to communicate awareness of a problem without directly addressing it. The mess existed in the room, and he had decided, with apparent completeness, that it was not the relevant thing. She noticed that he had not made her apologize for it. Not with words, not with a look, Not with any of the dozen small social mechanisms people use to extract acknowledgement of fault from someone who had made one. Nothing. As though the bag on the floor were simply a feature of the room now, something that had always been there, something requiring no one's accounting. She noticed that he noticed she was trying to take up as little space as possible in the chair. The way her shoulders had curved inward slightly, the way her backpack remained on though there was no reason to keep it on, the way she had chosen the chair against the wall rather than one closer to the table, the way she ate with the careful economy of someone who had learned to knead things quietly. She could see him noticing it in the particular quality of his attention, the way it didn't move from her even when she looked down at the plate. He said nothing about it. He did not invite her to take up more space, did not make her aware that he had seen it in a way that would require her to respond. He simply continued watching her with the same steady attention, and the watching was not an imposition but a presence, and the difference between those two things was something she felt without having a word for it. She finished the rice. She looked up. He was still watching her. The gold watch caught the light when he shifted slightly, forearms still resting on the table, and he said one more thing before she stood to leave. Still quiet. Still in that same register that had no performance in it. That was simply the sound of a man saying what he meant without dressing it. You're carrying something heavier than that bag was. Not a question. The statement of something already confirmed, being named aloud for the first time. Evelyn looked at him for a moment across the length of the room. She did not perform a reaction. She did not deflect or minimize or reach for the version of herself that made observations like that easier to receive by agreeing with them too quickly and moving on. She just looked at him with the same directness she brought to things she didn't yet have a category for, and let the sentence be true without deciding yet what to do with the truth. Then she picked up her backpack, stood, and walked back to the freight elevator. She rode down alone. The doors closed, and the car descended, and the 14th floor disappeared above her, and she stood in the slow industrial quiet of the elevator with the smell of food still on her hands and $40 in her delivery account, and the particular unsettled feeling of someone who has just been seen more clearly than they were prepared for. She was awake before the alarm. This was not unusual. Evelyn's body had developed, over years of 5:30 starts and midnight arithmetic, a kind of preemptive wakefulness, a low-level alertness that kicked in 20 minutes before the alarm as though sleep had decided the margin wasn't worth defending. She lay in the dark on Saturday morning and looked at the ceiling and listened to the city outside her window doing its 4 a.m. work, the garbage truck 2 streets over, the distant particular frequency of the highway that never fully went quiet, and she thought about a room on the 14th floor with marble floors and amber light, and a man who had looked at her hands instead of the mess she made. She had spent the night trying to convince herself it was less significant than it felt. She had done this with some success between approximately 1 and 2 in the morning, constructing a reasonable version of events in which she had delivered food to an unusual address, dropped the bag, been given a meal out of some combination of practicality and social management, and ridden home. Stranger things happened in this city. The tip had posted overnight, $40, as guaranteed. She had a back brake to fix. That was the practical outcome, and the practical outcome was the one that mattered. The version had held for about an hour. Then she had thought about the way his eyes moved to her hands rather than the floor, and the version had developed a crack she couldn't repair by reasoning at it. So she had lain in the dark with the crack and eventually stopped trying to fix it and just let the night be what it was. She got up at 4:15. She moved through the apartment in the specific quiet of someone who has a sleeping 17-year-old in the next room and has learned to exist in a smaller footprint. Coffee made without the grinder, the faucet turned just to the pressure that didn't rattle the pipes. Her uniform retrieved from the hook behind the bathroom door rather than the drawer that stuck and required force. She was dressed and out by 4:40 and on the bus by 4:53. The eviction notice was on the floor when she came back to the apartment that afternoon. She almost missed it. She came in from the hospital cafeteria shift at 1:15, dropped her bag, went straight to the bathroom, came out, and saw the white envelope against the baseboards near the door. Her name in the landlord's handwriting. Block letters, the kind of person used when they wanted the writing to look official, to carry the weight of something that couldn't be ignored by attributing it to tone. She picked it up. She read it standing in the hallway with her coat still on. Final notice. Vacate in 21 days. No extension consideration. Any further communication to be directed to the property management office, not to the landlord directly, which was new. The shift to formal channels, the institutional distance of a man who had decided the personal phase of this was finished. She folded it, put it in her jacket pocket, went to change for the salon. Ms. Renee had 4 clients on Saturdays. Evelyn worked through all 4, shampoos, rinses, holding foils under the heat lamp, sweeping the color cuttings from the floor between each client, mixing developer at the exact ratio Ms. Renee specified without being reminded because she had been doing it long enough that the ratios lived in her hands now. She did not mention the envelope. She did not mention the 14th floor. She moved through the salon with the efficient economy of someone for whom the work itself was a form of management, a way of keeping the body occupied while the mind processed things it wasn't ready to process directly. On her break, she took out her phone and opened the delivery app. Account suspended. Pending review. An inquiry from a third-party collections agency regarding a garnishment request had been flagged by the platform's compliance system, and her account had been temporarily restricted pending resolution of the inquiry. She would receive further communication within 3 to 5 business days. She read it twice. Her face did not change. She put the phone back in her apron pocket and went back to the salon floor and held a set of foils for the next 40 minutes with the same care she had been bringing to it all afternoon. And when the last client left and Ms. Renee said, "See you Friday," she said, "See you Friday," and rode the bus home and sat down at the kitchen table and took out the piece of paper she kept in the kitchen drawer specifically for this purpose. The arithmetic took 20 minutes the first time. It took the same 20 minutes the second time, and the third, and by the 17th iteration, she had stopped hoping it would produce a different answer and was simply running it the way you ran something when the running was the only thing keeping you from sitting in the full weight of the result. Without the delivery income, the numbers had one outcome. 1. She had checked it from every angle she knew how to check, and it was the same angle every time, just described differently. Rent was not possible. Without rent, the rest of it, Marcus's deposit, the utilities, the food budget she had already stripped to its minimum, arranged itself in a sequence of failures, each one triggering the next, the kind of cascade that started with an eviction notice and ended with the trade school confirmation coming off the refrigerator. She sat at the table at midnight with the paper in front of her and the pencil beside it, and the numbers that didn't work, and she was very still in the way she was still when she was holding something at arm's length that was very heavy, and she was running out of arm. Marcus came out of his room at 12:30. He was in the oversized gray sweatshirt he slept in, the one with the sleeve cuff that had frayed at the left wrist, and that Evelyn had mended twice with a needle and thread from the kit their mother had kept in the bathroom cabinet, and that she now kept in the same cabinet in the same place, because some things you did not move. His hair was loose, the way it got when he'd been asleep for a few hours. He looked at her at the kitchen table with the paper and the pencil and the coat that she realized, hadn't taken fully off, one arm still in the sleeve, the posture of someone who had sat down intending to get back up and had not gotten back up. He didn't ask what was wrong. He could see what was wrong. He had been seeing what was wrong in small increments for weeks, the way you saw things in someone you lived with, not in a single revelation, but in the accumulation of small details. The coat on the hook moved twice in one evening. The grocery list edited down from its edited down version. The way she had started checking her phone at the table rather than at the counter where she usually stood. He was 17, and he was not unobservant. He had seen it building. He went to the stove. He filled the kettle from the tap, the cold tap first the way their mother always did, then the hot, because their mother had said the cold tap had better pressure, and the pressure was what you wanted for the kettle, a theory that had no particular basis in fact, but that both of them had absorbed completely, and that neither of them had ever questioned or intended to question. He set the kettle on the burner. He got 2 cups from the cabinet. He put the tea bags in first, then waited for the water, then poured it, then got the honey squeeze bottle from beside the stove and did 2 stirs in each cup the way their mother had done 2 stirs, not 1, not 3, 2, because 2 was how she did it and how she had taught them and how it was done. He set a cup in front of Evelyn and sat down across from her with his own cup and wrapped both hands around it and said nothing. He just sat there in the quiet of the kitchen at 12:30 in the morning, with the arithmetic on the paper between them and the city doing its low nighttime work outside the window, and he let the quiet be quiet. That was what did it. Not the envelope folded in her jacket pocket. Not the suspension notification she had read and reread on the bus. Not the 17 iterations of numbers that arrived at the same place no matter how she arranged them. Her 17-year-old brother, filling the kettle the way their mother had, measuring honey with the same 2 stirs, sitting across from her at midnight so she would not be alone in it. She put her face in her hands and cried. Not loudly. Not the way grief came when it had been held back too long and arrived with force. This was quieter than that. More specific, the release of something that had been held at a particular tension for weeks and had finally, in the presence of 2 stir tea and a boy in a frayed sweatshirt who asked nothing of her, come down. She cried for 2 minutes, maybe 3. Marcus did not move. He did not say it was going to be okay because he was not the kind of person who said things he couldn't verify, which was something she had taught him and which she was grateful for now. In this moment, more than she could have explained. He sat with her in it the way she had always sat with him in the hard things, steady and present, and without requirement. When she was done, she lowered her hands. He slid the honey bottle across the table without comment, in case she wanted more. She looked at him across the kitchen table at 12:30 in the morning and loved him with the specific, uncomplicated totality that existed between people who had been each other's constant through the hardest years, and the feeling sat in her chest alongside everything else, distinct from it. Heavier in a different way. She picked up the cup. The tea was still warm. She drank it with 2 stirs worth of honey and said nothing, and neither did he. And outside the city continued its night, and inside the kitchen the arithmetic waited on the paper, unchanged, for morning. She went to bed at 1:15. She knew this precisely because she looked at the clock on her phone when she finally pulled the coat off and hung it on the hook behind the bedroom door. The one deliberate act of tidiness she allowed herself at the end of days when tidiness had otherwise been impossible. 1:15. She had to be up at 4:40 for the Sunday prep shift at the hospital, which ran shorter than the weekday service, but started at the same time because the kitchen did not reorganize itself around the schedule of the person cleaning it. 3 hours and 25 minutes. She had functioned on less. She lay down in her clothes because changing required a decision she didn't have the bandwidth to make, and because the apartment was cold in the specific way it got cold on November nights when the building's central heat cycled off at midnight to save the landlord money on a utility bill that appeared nowhere in the lease. She did not sleep. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and listened to Marcus settle in his room. The specific sequence of sounds she had memorized over years of thin walls and shared space. The creak of his mattress, the shift of his pillow, the long exhale that meant he had finally gone under. She waited until she heard it. Then she lay in the quiet and tried to make her mind do the thing she needed it to do, which was stop, which it declined to do, because her mind had been trained over years of tight arithmetic and tighter margins to treat silence as an opportunity to run the numbers again, and it was running them now with the focused persistence of something that didn't know how to stop being useful even when usefulness was not what was needed. The notification came through at 1:47. She knew it was her phone because the screen lit the ceiling above her in a brief pale rectangle. She didn't reach for it immediately. She lay there looking at the reflected light for a moment, then rolled over and picked it up. It was from the delivery app's internal messaging system. Not a text. The in-app messaging function, the one customers use to give gate codes or ask for extra napkins or occasionally to apologize for a bad rating they had given in a moment of frustration. She had received maybe 30 messages through that system in 2 years of deliveries. She opened it. The account name was a string of numbers, no personal identifier. The message was 5 words and a phone number. Call when you're ready. That was it. No name. No context. No explanation of who was sending it or what ready meant or what the call would contain. Just the instruction and the number and the assumption, apparently, that she would understand enough to do something with it. She looked at the number. She recognized the prefix. She had seen it in the delivery details for the 14th floor order, the contact number attached to the account that had placed it. She had not called it during the delivery, had not needed to, had simply followed the instructions in the order notes and ridden to the address, and entered the code, and ridden the freight elevator to the 14th floor. She set the phone face down on the mattress. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about the word ready, which was doing a lot of work in a very short message. Ready implied a state she was expected to arrive at on her own timeline, which implied the sender understood she was not currently in that state, which implied a level of attention to her situation that she had not requested and was not sure how to receive. She turned the word over the way she turned difficult things over, carefully, from multiple angles, looking for the place where it stopped being complicated and became simply what it was. She did not find that place. She picked up the phone, looked at the message again, set it on the nightstand face down, and closed her eyes. She was still awake at 3. At 3:15 she got up. She did this quietly, the same small footprint movements she used when Marcus was sleeping, though Marcus was already awake. She could tell by the absence of the particular quality of stillness his room had when he was fully under, something she had learned to read through the wall the way you learned to read the specific silences of people you lived with closely enough and long enough. Neither of them acknowledged the other. She padded to the kitchen in her socks. She stood in front of the refrigerator. Marcus's trade school enrollment confirmation was held to the door by a magnet shaped like a chef's hat. Ceramic, small, slightly chipped on the rim from the time it had been knocked from the counter, and she had kept it anyway, because her mother had bought it at a farmer's market in Decatur 8 years ago on a Saturday morning. Evelyn could still locate precisely in her memory, the light coming low and gold through the market tent, the smell of kettle corn from a vendor 2 stalls over, her mother holding up the magnet between 2 fingers and saying for your kitchen one day, baby, in the specific tone she used when she was not wishing for something but stating it, when the belief was already so complete in her that the distance between now and then was simply a matter of time. Evelyn had been 16. She had rolled her eyes in the way 16-year-olds rolled their eyes at their mother's certainties and said okay, Mom, had bought a popsicle from the next stall and thought nothing more of it. She looked at the magnet now. She looked at the enrollment confirmation behind it, the trade school letterhead, Marcus's name in the header, the program start date that did not move. She thought about 3 weeks and a final notice and numbers that didn't work and the arithmetic she had run 17 times and would run again in the morning and arrive at the same place. She picked up her phone. She looked at the message. 5 words and a number. She thought about the 14th floor and a man who had not looked at the floor and had asked if she had eaten and had said you're carrying something heavier than that bag was in the tone of someone identifying a fact rather than offering a comfort. She thought about what it would mean to call. She thought about what it would mean not to. She put the phone down on the counter. She went to the cabinet and got a glass and filled it from the tap and drank it standing at the sink looking at the window above it, which showed her the dark of the building's inner courtyard and her own reflection superimposed on it. Red hoodie, braids loose, the particular expression of someone who has been awake for too long making a decision they have already made and are not yet ready to admit they have made. She picked the phone back up. She had rehearsed nothing. She had no prepared version of herself to deploy, no managed presentation of the situation that made it sound more organized than it was. She had only the actual situation, which was 3 weeks and a final notice and a suspended account, and a brother asleep in the next room, with his first month of trade school still 6 weeks away, and a magnet on the refrigerator from a farmer's market in Decatur, and the specific understanding that not calling was also a choice, and that choice had a cost she had already calculated and could not afford. She pressed the number. It rang twice. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was the same register as the 14th floor, unhurried, direct, the tone of a man who had not been asleep and had not needed to be, who operated in the late hours of the night with the same composed efficiency he brought to everything else. She said her name. There was a brief pause, not of surprise, but of the particular quality of attention she was beginning to recognize as simply how he listened. He said he was glad she called. She said she needed to talk. He named a restaurant in Doraville and a time the following evening. He said it without asking if she knew the area or whether the time worked or any of the social scaffolding people erected around practical arrangements. He said it the way he said everything, as though the words were already the right words, and the only remaining question was whether she would meet them. She said she would be there. He said good. Then the call ended. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with the phone in her hand, and the courtyard dark outside the window, and the chef's hat magnet on the refrigerator, and the enrollment confirmation behind it. The call had lasted 40 seconds. She had committed to nothing except showing up, which was the one thing she had never had difficulty doing regardless of what showing up cost her. She went back to bed. She lay down in the dark. And for the first time since the elevator doors had opened on the 14th floor 2 nights ago, she slept. She arrived 8 minutes early. The restaurant was on a side street in Doraville that she had passed on delivery routes without ever stopping, the kind of block that existed in every Atlanta neighborhood just outside the radius of gentrification. A dry cleaner, a cell phone repair shop, a hair supply store with its gate half down, and at the end of the row, a Korean restaurant with a handwritten menu taped inside the window, and a neon sign in the shape of a bowl that had been lit so long the red had faded to a pale orange. The kind of place that had been there for 20 years and intended to be there for 20 more and had no interest in being discovered by anyone who needed to be told it was good. She pushed the door open. Small inside, 8 or 9 tables, low light from pendants above each one, the smell of something braising in the back that had been braising for hours. An older woman behind the counter looked up, assessed her in the efficient way of restaurant owners who had been doing this long enough to read customers by the way they came through the door, and nodded toward the corner table without being asked. He was already there. Dark trousers, a charcoal shirt, no jacket, the gold watch. The same composed stillness she had first seen across a marble floor, now contained in a corner booth in a neighborhood restaurant where nobody was performing anything for anyone. He looked like a man who had chosen this place specifically because it required nothing of him except to be present in it, and who found that quality restful rather than diminishing. He stood briefly when she came in. She hadn't expected that, and waited until she sat before he did. No room full of men. No amber light from expensive fixtures. No food on the floor. Just him, a glass of water, and the particular quality of attention she had been thinking about for 3 days without being able to stop. She ordered tea from the woman who appeared at the table, spent $3 she had allocated for this meeting, and then looked at him and told him everything. The way she told herself things. Plainly, in sequence, without softening the numbers or performing distress or pausing for him to register how hard it was. The medical debt and the collections and the 14 months of calls she had been managing with organized composure and the gradually diminishing margin of safety that had brought her to a suspended account and a final notice in the same 24 hours. Marcus's program. The deposit in the untouchable account. The arithmetic that stopped working the moment one income stream disappeared. She laid it out the way she laid out a delivery route, start to finish, most efficient path, no unnecessary stops. He listened the way he had listened in the 14th floor room, completely, without filling the silences she paused in, without the performed nodding that meant someone was counting down to their turn. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone collecting their thoughts, but the quiet of someone who had already collected them and was deciding which ones to offer. Then he asked her what she actually needed. Not what would help. Not what would make the situation more manageable. Not what would get her through this month or the next one. What she needed to have the life she was trying to build. She looked at him across the small table. The question had landed somewhere she hadn't prepared for, and she sat with it for a moment without deflecting, which was unusual for her, which she noticed. She had been asked versions of this question before. Her high school counselor, a financial aid officer at the community college she'd taken 2 semesters of before the money situation required a different plan, a church deacon who had meant well. All of those versions had been questions about survival, about continuation, about the minimum required to remain functional. This was a different question. This was the question behind all those questions, the one nobody had thought to ask directly or had known she was building something worth asking it about. She gave him the practical version first, because the practical version was what she had ready. The debt cleared. Marcus in school. A few months where the arithmetic had enough room in it to breathe. He listened. Then he took the paper napkin from beside his water glass and wrote on it. A name, a phone number, 2 lines. He slid it across the table. A financial advocate named Diana Osei, who specialized in medical debt negotiation and had worked cases like hers before and understood the specific pressure points that moved hospital billing departments. He said she worked for Evelyn, not for him. He said it clearly, without leaving room for ambiguity, because he understood that the ambiguity was the part she would have the most difficulty with. She picked up the napkin. She looked at the name and the number. She looked at him. Then he told her what he was. He did it the same way he did everything, directly, in the same level tone he had used to ask if she had eaten, and to say she was carrying something heavy, and to give her a chair when she needed one. The organization, the network, what it ran on, and what it made possible, and what it made him. Dangerous, he said, is the accurate word. Not a warning, not an apology. Information. He was giving her information because he had decided she was someone who deserved to make informed choices rather than managed ones. She listened without performing a reaction. She had the kind of face, when she chose to use it, that gave nothing away. The same face she used in the landlord's hallway and the app's suspension notification and the salon on the day she found the eviction notice in her pocket. She used it now not because she felt nothing but because she was processing something that deserved real processing rather than reflexive response, and she needed a moment to do that properly. When he finished, she was quiet for a few seconds. Then she looked at him across the table and asked him something that arrived before she had decided whether to ask it, the way honest questions sometimes did. What did you want before all of this? The silence that followed was the longest thing in the room. Not uncomfortable, substantial. The kind of silence that had weight in it, that meant something was being encountered rather than avoided. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was close enough to it that she understood the question had reached somewhere past the managed surface of him. She watched something move behind his eyes, brief, private, the specific movement of something that has been still for a long time being touched for the first time. The woman came and refilled her water. The restaurant continued its small, ordinary sounds around them. He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. Then he said, with a quality of honesty she recognized because it was the same quality she had brought to the table 20 minutes ago, that he would need to think about how to answer that. Not a deflection. She understood the difference. A deflection closed a door. This was a man standing at the threshold of one he hadn't opened in a long time, taking stock of what was on the other side before he stepped through. She accepted it without pushing. She had learned, over years of living on tight margins, that you did not force a thing before it was ready or you lost the real version of it. They finished the evening talking about other things. The restaurant, which she learned he had been coming to for 6 years, which explained why the woman refilled their water without being asked and left them alone without hovering. The neighborhood, the way Doraville had held its character across decades of change that had reshaped everything around it. She told him about Ms. Renee's salon, the particular ecology of a neighborhood salon that had been in the same spot for 18 years, the way it functioned as a kind of informal archive of everything that had happened on that block since it opened. He listened the way he listened to everything, which was completely, and asked one question that told her he had been paying attention. She rode the bus home at 9:45 with the paper napkin folded in her jacket pocket and the question she had asked him still open in the air between them, and the specific quality of the silence he had given it settled in her chest alongside everything else, distinct from it. Not heavy. More like the feeling of a door left ajar in a house you thought was entirely closed. She called Diana Osei at 8 o'clock the next morning. It was a Thursday evening when Marcus found it. Evelyn was on a late delivery shift. She had taken 2 extra orders to make up the income gap from the days the account had been suspended, building the buffer back up dollar by dollar the way she built everything, incrementally and without complaint. She had left at 6:15 and wasn't expected back until 10. Marcus had been looking for her spare phone charger, the white one she kept in a fabric pouch under the mattress along with the building's Wi-Fi password written on a post-it and the folded copy of their mother's birth certificate. She had transferred from apartment to apartment for 3 years because she couldn't think of a better place to keep something irreplaceable. He found the charger. He also found the notebook. He didn't tell her that evening. She came in at 10:20, later than expected because the last delivery had taken her to Buckhead, and the return ride was uphill and wet. And she came through the door with her cap dark from the rain and her backpack heavier than it should have been with unsold cold packs. She hadn't had time to return to the pickup point. He was at the kitchen table doing coursework from the trade school's pre-enrollment reading list. They had sent materials 2 weeks before the start date, optional preparation that he had treated as mandatory because that was how he approached things, which was something he had learned from her. He said hey. She said hey. She changed out of her wet clothes and made herself a bowl of cereal and sat on the couch, and they watched 40 minutes of television without talking about anything important, which was a normal evening, which was its own kind of good. He said nothing about the notebook that night, or the next day, or the day after that. He waited until Sunday. Sunday mornings had a particular quality in their apartment, slower than the rest of the week, less obligated, the one morning where the alarm didn't govern the first hour. Evelyn usually slept until 7, which for her was late, and came out to find the coffee already made because Marcus had started doing that 6 months ago without being asked, the same way he had started doing the grocery run on Thursdays without being asked, absorbing the household's needs the way she had always absorbed them and distributing them back without announcement. She had noticed and had not made a thing of it because making a thing of it would have embarrassed him, and also because she recognized the instinct, the quiet helpfulness of someone who had been paying attention. She came out at 7:12 to the smell of eggs and toast and the particular sound of orange juice being poured, which meant he had bought the good kind, the kind she only got on Fridays when the delivery tips were strong. She could tell from the kitchen's sounds that he had been up for a while, that this breakfast had been planned rather than assembled from whatever was available. She sat down. He set the plate in front of her. He set the orange juice. He sat across from her with his own plate, and for a few minutes they ate in the comfortable Sunday quiet, the city outside doing its weekend morning version of itself, slower and less insistent than the weekday one. Then he reached beside him and set the notebook on the table between them. He had opened it to the most recent menu page, the one she had written and rewritten 4 times, the one that was the clearest version of the concept, the one where the dishes were named properly and the plating notes were specific and the pricing was based on actual supplier research rather than estimates. Her mother's recipes rendered as they had always deserved to be rendered. The jerk chicken with the sourcing note about the Scotch bonnets, the oxtail with the suggested accompaniments, the sweet potato pudding listed as a signature item with a small asterisk, and the note people will ask for this first. He set it on the table and looked at her and said he had found it on Thursday and had read it cover to cover and had been watching her work on this for 2 years and wanted to know why she hadn't started. Evelyn looked at the notebook. She looked at her handwriting on the open page, the careful script she used when she was writing something she intended to keep, not the quick shorthand of grocery lists and delivery notes, but the handwriting of someone making a record of something that mattered. She looked at the asterisk beside the sweet potato pudding. She looked at her brother across the table, 17 years old, with his pre-enrollment reading list and his Thursday grocery runs and his 2-stir tea at midnight, and she gave him the answer she had been giving herself for 2 years. She said, "Because first I have to get you through school, and first I have to clear the debt, and first I have to stabilize everything, get the margins right, get the conditions to a point where starting doesn't mean risking what we already have." She said it clearly and in order, the way she said everything, and it sounded exactly as reasonable as it had always sounded inside her own head, which was very reasonable, which was the problem with it. Marcus listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not make the face he sometimes made when he disagreed with something, the slight tightening at the corners of his mouth, the small contained exhale. He listened to the whole answer with the same complete attention she had always given him, the attention she had modeled for him by example across 17 years, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom said first too. She said first her whole life." Evelyn stopped. Not visibly. Nothing moved in her face and nothing changed in her posture, and she did not put down her fork with any drama or look away from him. But something inside her stopped with the sudden completeness of a door closing. Not slowly, not with warning, just closed, the way the truth closed when it finally arrived in a form you couldn't negotiate with. She sat with it. She let it settle into the kitchen, into the Sunday morning, into the space between her and the notebook open on the table between them. She looked at the page. She looked at the asterisk. She thought about her mother's recipe box on the kitchen counter, the handwritten index cards inside it, the sweet potato pudding that relatives had been requesting by name for 20 years at every gathering, the food that had been made in other people's kitchens for a woman who had always been one first away from her own. First after the rent stabilized. First after the girls were older. First after the debt from the car was cleared. First after the slow season at the second job ended. First after first, until there were no more firsts left to clear and no more mornings to start in, and the recipe box sat on someone else's counter being kept by a daughter who was now doing the same calculation in a different apartment in a different year with a different list of firsts that had no end. Marcus had not said it to wound her. She understood that. He had said it the way he said everything important. Plainly, because he had learned from her that plain was kinder than managed, that the truth given directly was a form of respect rather than an injury. He had said it because he loved her, and because he had been watching, and because he was 17 years old, and had already understood something that their mother had not been given the time or the space to understand, and that Evelyn had been in the process of not understanding for 2 years while a notebook sat under her mattress accumulating the evidence of a life she kept postponing. She did not reach for a safe answer. There wasn't one, and she knew it, and reaching for it anyway would have been a betrayal of the moment and of him and of the notebook open between them and of the woman whose recipes were in it. She sat in the silence of a Sunday kitchen with her orange juice and her eggs going slightly cold, and the most honest question she had ever been asked sitting in the air between herself and her brother, and she let it be what it was. She looked at the notebook for a long time. Then she looked at Marcus. Then she reached across the table and pulled it toward her and turned to the next blank page and uncapped the pen she kept in her jacket pocket and wrote the date at the top. He watched her. He said nothing. He picked up his fork and finished his eggs and let her write. And the Sunday morning continued around them. And outside the city did its slow weekend work. And inside the kitchen something shifted that had been in the same position for 2 years and was finally, simply, ready to move. Diana Osei called at 8:43 on a Tuesday morning. 11 days after Evelyn had first dialed her number from the kitchen counter with the chef's hat magnet visible from where she stood. Evelyn was on the bus to the hospital cafeteria shift, standing in the aisle with her hand on the overhead rail and her backpack between her feet when the call came through. She moved to the back of the bus where it was quieter and answered on the second ring. Diana said, "It's done." 2 words. The same economy Evelyn had learned to appreciate in people who had done difficult work long enough to understand that the result was the point and everything else was noise. She said it the way a person said something they had said many times before and found no less satisfying for the repetition, with the quiet, professional pleasure of someone who had aimed at a specific target and hit it cleanly. The settlement was $4,100. Structured payment over 6 months, first installment due in 30 days. The hospital's billing department had accepted it through a negotiated resolution that Diana had pursued through 3 specific channels simultaneously, applying pressure at the points where the institution's interest in a clean settlement outweighed its interest in a prolonged collections process. She had not threatened anyone. She had not needed to. She had simply known which questions to ask and in which order, which was the thing Evelyn had never had access to. Not the leverage, not the aggression, just the knowledge of where the room had doors in it and how they opened. $23,000 for $100. Reduced to $4,100. In 11 days. Evelyn stood at the back of the bus with her hand still on the overhead rail and said nothing for a moment. Diana, who had done this long enough to understand what that silence meant, waited without filling it. Then Evelyn said thank you in a voice that was composed and meant it completely. Diana said she would send the settlement confirmation by end of day and that Evelyn should keep it permanently, physical copy and digital, because institutions had a tendency to misplace resolutions that had cost them something. She said it without bitterness, as fact, the way you told someone where the exits were. Useful information, nothing more. Then she said one more thing before she hung up. She said, "You should have had someone in your corner a long time ago. I'm glad you do now." The bus reached Evelyn's stop. She got off and walked the 2 blocks to the hospital and did her shift, steam table, trays, the morning service line, with the settlement confirmation number written on the back of her hand in ballpoint pen, because she had not had paper when Diana read it out, and she was not going to forget it, and she was not going to trust only her phone with it until it existed on paper she could hold. The delivery app account reinstated itself 4 days after the settlement cleared. The garnishment inquiry was formally withdrawn, the compliance flag was removed, and the account status returned to active with no notation in her record, as though the suspension had simply not occurred. She checked it 3 times across the morning to make sure the status held. It held. The landlord situation resolved itself 2 days after that, through a channel Evelyn had not anticipated. A letter arrived from Diana's office. She had mentioned during their second call that she would be reviewing the building's public records as part of the account documentation, standard procedure, and that anything she found would be noted, citing 2 housing code violations that had been identified during the review. The hallway heating unit had been non-functional since September and had been reported to the city twice by other tenants without response. The exterior door lock required a non-standard second key turn that did not meet current building code requirements and had been flagged in a prior inspection. The letter noted that both violations were the landlord's legal responsibility to remediate, and that the tenant's account would be maintained in good standing pending a standard payment arrangement while the remediation was scheduled. The landlord called that afternoon. He accepted the payment plan without further discussion. He did not mention the eviction notice. He did not use the formal channel. He called her directly, the way he had before he decided the personal phase was finished, and spoke in the careful tone of a man who had just been reminded that the person on the other side of the arrangement had options he had not previously accounted for. She said thank you and hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a moment with her hands flat on the surface, feeling the specific quality of a weight that has been distributed more evenly after being carried in one place for too long. Not gone, still present, but redistributed, which was a different thing, which made movement possible in a way it had not been before. The arithmetic worked again that evening. She ran it once, not 17 times. It balanced with a margin she had not seen in 14 months. Small, not comfortable, but real. She looked at it for a moment and then folded the paper and put it in the kitchen drawer and did not run it again. She called Yun-Ji Cho from the kitchen table at 8:15, after Marcus had gone to his room with his trade school pre-reading and the apartment had settled into its evening quiet. She told him the debt was cleared and the account was reinstated and the landlord situation was resolved. She said it plainly and in order, the way she had laid the problem out at the Dorville restaurant 3 weeks earlier, because the resolution deserved the same straightforwardness as the crisis. He listened. When she finished, he asked how she felt. She considered the question the way she considered things she intended to answer honestly. Not what she was supposed to feel, not the performed version, how she actually felt. In the kitchen at 8:15 on a Tuesday with the balanced arithmetic in the drawer and the settlement confirmation on her phone and the notebook on the table where Marcus had left it on Sunday, which she had not put back under the mattress. She said, lighter. Then she said something she had not said aloud to anyone in 2 years. Not to Marcus, not to Ms. Renee on the slow Fridays when the salon was quiet and conversation came easily, not to herself in anything louder than the margins of a notebook she kept hidden because keeping it hidden was a way of protecting it from the possibility of failing. She said, I think I'm ready to start. The words came out with the particular quality of something that has been held for a long time being finally released. Not dramatic, not trembling, just present in the air in a way it hadn't been before she said it. Real in a new way that required the saying to become fully true. Yun-Ji Cho was quiet for a moment. Not the brief procedural quiet of someone transitioning between thoughts, the considered quiet of someone receiving something carefully, treating it with the weight it deserved. Then he said, I know a commercial kitchen space in West Atlanta. Small operation. The owner owes me a conversation. He paused. Would you like to have it? Evelyn looked at the notebook on the table. She looked at the date she had written at the top of the blank page on Sunday morning, the pen still lying beside it where she had set it down. She thought about Diana saying you should have had someone in your corner a long time ago. She thought about Marcus saying mom said first her whole life. She thought about an asterisk beside a recipe for sweet potato pudding and a chef's hat magnet on a refrigerator in Decatur 8 years ago, and a woman saying for your kitchen one day, baby, in a voice that meant she believed it completely. She said yes before she had finished deciding, which was how she knew the answer was real, not the managed version of yes. Not the yes that came with a list of conditions attached. Not the yes she gave people when she meant yes pending further review. Just yes, plain, the way she had been learning to say things since a man in an amber-lit room had asked her a plain question, and she had given him the plain answer, and something had shifted that had not shifted back. Yun-Ji Cho said he would make the introduction. He said he would text her the details in the morning. Then the call ended with the same efficiency as everything he did. Nothing added that the moment didn't require. She sat at the kitchen table for a while after. The city did its Tuesday evening work outside the window. The notebook sat open on the table with the date written at the top of a blank page and the pen beside it. She picked up the pen and started writing. 3 months after the elevator doors opened on the 14th floor, Evelyn Dominique signed a lease on a commercial kitchen in West Atlanta. The space was on a block that had the particular character of a neighborhood in the middle of deciding what it wanted to be. A tire shop that had been there since the 80s beside a graphic design studio that had been there since last year. A woman selling plates from a folding table on the corner on Saturday mornings. A mural on the east-facing wall of the building across the street that someone had painted recently and carefully in colors that meant something to the people who lived there. The kitchen itself was small and exactly right. A prep counter running the full length of one wall, a 6-burner commercial range with even heat across all burners, which she had tested twice before signing. A walk-in with capacity for her current operation with room to grow modestly. A utility sink with good water pressure and overhead fluorescent lights that worked. All of them. Without a second key turn or a maintenance request or a landlord who stopped answering calls after September. The address was hers. Not held by a building manager or a delivery app or a collections agency pursuing a garnishment inquiry against her name. Hers, on the lease, in the same careful handwriting she used for the notebook. She brought the recipe box on the first day, set it on the prep counter next to the notebook, which she had stopped keeping under the mattress the Sunday Marcus put it on the kitchen table, and she wrote a date at the top of a blank page. She stood at the counter for a moment looking at both of them. Her mother's handwriting on the index cards inside the box, her own handwriting in the notebook margins, 2 years of planning that had always been pointed at this counter, this kitchen, this morning, even when she had been calling it something else and keeping it hidden where no one could watch it fail. She put the chef's hat magnet on the walk-in door. Marcus called her on a Tuesday evening in the middle of his first month of trade school. She was mid-prep, breaking down a whole chicken with the focused efficiency of someone who had practiced this specific movement until it required no conscious direction from her hands, and her phone lit up on the counter beside the notebook. She set down the knife and answered. He had received his first-month assessment, highest marks in his cohort. The instructor had pulled him aside after class to ask if he had prior experience in the field, which he didn't, and he told Evelyn this with the particular quality of someone delivering news they have been rehearsing the delivery of all day, trying to keep the pride in their voice to a register that didn't sound like showing off, and not quite succeeding. She listened with her hand pressed flat against the walk-in door, looking at the chef's hat magnet from 3 inches away. She thought about a Saturday morning in Decatur and the particular tone of voice her mother had used, not wishing but stating, not hoping but knowing. And she stood in her kitchen with the smell of prep work on her hands and let the knowing travel. She told him she was proud. She said it plainly, without qualification, which was how she had been learning to say things. The gallery booking had come through a neighborhood pop-up she had done the month before the kitchen lease was signed, in Ms. Renee's parking lot on a Saturday afternoon with a folding table and a borrowed chafing dish and 40 portions of her mother's oxtail priced at $12 a plate, because Diana had looked at her pricing model and told her to charge what the food was worth and not what she thought people in that neighborhood could afford, because those two numbers were not the same number. The gallery director had come through with her daughter, had eaten standing up, had asked for a card that Evelyn had printed the week before at the FedEx on Moreland Avenue on cardstock that was heavier than she needed for the budget she was on, but that she had bought anyway, because some things were worth the extra dollar. The director had called the following morning. The event was 40 people. A fundraising reception for a West End arts organization, Friday evening, 6 to 9, past appetizers and 2 station dishes and the sweet potato pudding as a dessert offering. Evelyn had confirmed the booking, drawn up a contract using a template Diana had sent her, collected a deposit, and built a production schedule that accounted for every hour between the booking and the event date. She had not accounted for the 2 servers who arrived 40 minutes late because they had the wrong address in their phones, which she discovered at 5:45 when she was already at the venue setting up and the right address had been in the confirmation email she had sent twice. She had not accounted for the warming tray element failing in the second hour, a slow drop in temperature that she caught during a routine check at 7:15 and addressed by consolidating the remaining portions into a single vessel over a sterno unit she carried in her kit, because Ms. Renee had told her once that the professionals always had a backup for the backup, and she had written that down in the notebook margins and apparently absorbed it completely. She had not accounted for the gallery director's business partner deciding at 8 o'clock that he wanted to make an announcement that required moving the station dish table 6 feet to the left in the middle of service, which she had accommodated without expression because the client's event was the client's event and her job was to make the food excellent inside whatever shape the evening took. The last guest left at 10:50. The director shook her hand at the door with the particular warmth of someone who had been watching something go right all evening and wanted to acknowledge it directly. She said she would be in touch about the spring program. She said the sweet potato pudding had been the subject of 3 separate conversations she had overheard during the evening, which was the most useful review Evelyn had ever received. She drove back to the kitchen, unloaded everything, cleaned every surface in the order her production schedule specified, stored every item in its designated place. She did this without rushing and without music and without the distraction of her phone, because the kitchen deserved the same quality of attention at the end of the evening as it had received at the beginning, and because this was the kind of care she had always brought to things that mattered to her, and the kitchen mattered to her, and she was no longer in the business of hiding the things that did. She was at the prep counter at 6 in the morning on the Monday after. Notebook open. A February booking inquiry had come in through a referral from the gallery director. A 40th birthday dinner, 12 people, private residence in Cascade Heights. The host had mentioned her mother's recipes specifically, had said someone at the gallery told her about the oxtail. Evelyn was writing the proposed menu in the handwriting she used for things she intended to keep. The kitchen was quiet. The city outside was doing its early morning work in the particular blue-gray light that came before the sun cleared the buildings. The light that made Atlanta look briefly like something from before the day had decided what it was going to be. She wrote without stopping, without revising mid-sentence, without the qualifier she had spent 2 years appending to every plan. The not yet, the first I have to, the when the conditions are right. She wrote because the kitchen was hers, and the morning was hers, and the notebook was open, and there was no condition left to wait for. She thought about what Yoon Ji Cho had eventually said, 2 weeks after the Dorville restaurant. In a phone call he had initiated unprompted because he had apparently decided that the answer to her question deserved better than indefinite deferral. He had told her about a version of himself at 19 that the organization had replaced one reasonable choice at a time until the replacement was complete and the original was too far back to see clearly. He had said it without self-pity, which was the only way she could have received it. She had told him it wasn't too late to want things. He had said he was working on believing that. She had said, take your time. She had meant it. She had learned recently, with some effort, that permission given freely and without deadline was the most useful kind. She did not have a clean name for what they were to each other and had stopped trying to build one. She knew that he had looked at her hands instead of the floor, and that single act of attention had set something in motion that ended with her name on a lease and her mother's recipes on a prep counter and a notebook open at 6 in the morning with no date for later written at the top of the page. She knew he had never required her to be smaller. She knew that when she had asked him something nobody in his world asked, he had not dismissed it, but had carried it carefully until he was ready to answer. That said something she didn't need to translate into a category to understand. Here is what the story is actually about. Not the debt, not the room on the 14th floor, not the man who looked at her hands and told a hungry person to sit down. Those are the mechanism. The story is about what Evelyn understood on a Sunday morning when her brother set a notebook on the table and said 4 words their mother had lived in the wrong direction of her entire life. Taking care of people and taking care of yourself are not competing obligations. They are the same act, aimed in different directions. The woman who feeds everyone else is allowed to eat. The woman who holds everything together is allowed to want something that is entirely hers. Not someday. Not when the conditions are finally right. Not after the first and the first and the first have all been resolved. Now. Here. In the kitchen that already exists, with the notebook already written, with the hands that were shaking not from weakness, but from the accumulated weight of carrying something for too long without being told that setting it down was permitted. You do not have to finish sacrificing before you are permitted to begin living. The life built in the margins, in notebooks kept under mattresses, in menus written between deliveries, in plans revised and re-revised and never abandoned even when they were never acted on. That life was always real. It always deserved a kitchen with the address on the lease and the recipe box on the counter and the chef's hat magnet on the walk-in door and a morning with no one in it except the work you were always going to do once you gave yourself permission. The permission was never arriving from outside. It was never going to be delivered by a landlord or unlocked by a debt finally cleared or granted by anyone who needed you to keep waiting. It lived where it had always lived, in the same place as the notebook, in the same place as the dream, in the same place a woman whispered to her baby at 4 in the morning in a kitchen that wasn't hers yet. Inside. Waiting. Patient. Already written. The only thing it ever needed was for you to stop apologizing for it and open the book.